I think this is the dinner party conversation at the moment,
everywhere.
isn't it? What is going on with property values right now?
Yeah. It's too early.
I think we all need to take a big, deep breath, don't we?
Yeah.
In terms of what's happening out there, there's no doubt that we had fantastic growth. Areas of growth that we haven't seen since sort of 2001 to 2003, and now we're coming off that level. And the reason we're coming off that level, it's actually been manufactured. So it's been manufactured through APRA and also some of the tightening around the lending policy. We just saw there at the auction in Kew in terms of the estate agent talking about finance is so critical. So we've taken that demand level out of the market. And when you take that demand level out of the market, it stops that FOMO effect, you know, that fear of missing out. And so we've gone over the peak in sort of September of 2017, and now we're seeing the correction. Now, this is my 6th correction, so I've been around a while, so I sort of know the cycles in which we work in. And it's really, for me, there's certainly some headwinds in terms of more than we've had in the past. So I do see the correction being probably in that sort of 10 to 15% range. Right. But we can actually change this. We can actually do some different things to be able to re-stimulate the economy, and I think that's up to the regulators.
Okay.
We talk about it a lot, and we've had you on, you know, you're a great friend of our show, of the channel. It had to happen though, didn't it? I mean, the horses were bolting.
Totally.
We were, you know, the gates were swung open, they were gone, and we needed to slow it down for various reasons. Some of the prices that were being gone over, people were buying shocking properties, doing nothing, putting it back on the market and making money. So it sort of did have to happen, but it's not as, you know, the word Armageddon, it's not as dire as that to slow it back down.
No, I think the sort of commentary around 40, 50% is unhelpful. Okay, so yes, we had over-exuberance, and when you get over-exuberance in any market where there's strong demand and tight supply, you're going to get appreciation. So when you see record low interest rates coming into play, which is where we're at, so we're at record low settings of interest rates, naturally we're going to see asset appreciation, and that's exactly what happened. So APRA sensibly came in and started to put some levers into the market to slow that demand down. So the first thing they did was put a speed limit in terms of on investment lending. Then they circled back for interest-only lenders, and now they started charging investors a little bit more. So the appetite has slowed down, and that's meant that we've seen the peak of the market, and now we're coming off that. So good news is the speculators are out. You know, that was pushing these prices that were going to unsustainable levels. And I've commented before on the show about 54% of new lending going to investors is unsustainable. You know, and as an investment advisor, those warnings were clear to us. So we think the regulators have done the right thing to introduce these macro-prudential regulations. But now it's also incumbent on them to watch the market and potentially look at the levers that they're in control of to try and make sure that it is a softer landing rather than a hard landing.
So Ben, let's get out our crystal ball, and you say that we are in correction. I know that there have been some pretty dire headlines, some calling 40%, others 20%, top to bottom. What do you think? How much worse could it get from here, and what is, say, the best case scenario even?
Yeah, so Leanne, I think we need to be understanding that the property market is multiple markets. So what we're really talking about here is namely Sydney, you know, which has had over 80% growth since 2012. So then you've got Melbourne's had about 65% growth in that same time period. We're actually tipping that Brisbane is going to have some growth. We're tipping that Adelaide is also going to have some growth. So that's a big news story, but we definitely think that the heady days of the Sydney and the Melbourne markets are going to come off. Now, I'm not so worried about established areas where we've got good household income and good wages, good employment. Those areas are probably going to come off around 10%. I am concerned about clusters of marketplaces being unit block areas where there's clusters of large developments that have occurred, where there's a lot of investment activity that went in there in, say, 2015, 16, 17. Those areas are going to come under price pressure because the property prices aren't going to val up at the off the plan price points, and secondly, everyone's going to come out of their interest only period at the same time. So if there's been a lot of investment activity in those areas, those particular pockets aren't going to perform well. and we might see as much as 25% price correction in those areas. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be panic.
Too much stock.
Yeah, there is. There's too much stock, so there is an oversupply in those particular areas. Some house and land package areas as well went too far. They're just not. They don't represent fair market value.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, fair market value is what a willing buyer is to pay a willing seller, and we see that live at any auction on a weekend. And we've definitely seen the appetite for borrowing money and buying property has cooled off.
Yes.
So that is naturally going to see that slow down, and if we get realistic vendors, we're going to see some of that correction come through.
So you talk about, you know, these prime suburbs that obviously hold value. They retain their value.
Yeah.
They're more established. What do you think is impacting value for people who might be in these areas where there's lots of apartments, or in new suburbs where there's a whole sea of brand new house and land packages?
Well, it's that demand and supply story. Ultimately, price will find its equilibrium once we go through shortage of supply, high demand, property prices pop, that sort of thing happens as well. So it's really important that you understand that when you're looking at property, that you understand it's going to go through these natural cycles. But when you do see a glut of properties that are oversupplied, then ultimately there's going to be a story around pressure on those price points, and that's going to be worse than other markets.
Ben, you're obviously a buyer's agent,
Yes.
and you are on the ground yourself, so you're really out there and you're seeing what's going on. From your perspective, I mean, are you still seeing a lot of that demand coming from home buyers? You talk obviously a lot about supply, but the demand side of things, how are you seeing it on the ground?
Yeah, on the ground is, so in the heady days, you've got between 5 and 8 bidders. Like, it's frantic, it's crazy, you know, and as you say, just list a property and off it runs. But ultimately, when you get to a marketplace like we're getting at, you're getting to a situation where you might have just the one buyer or the two buyers. So the agents have to work harder. They need to qualify their buyers better. They also need to qualify the range that they can push to. So what we're also seeing is, you know, reserves were being smashed when you've got all this pent-up demand, but now we're actually falling more likely in the quoting range. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in Q next up, in terms of, we've got a quoting range of 2 to 2.2 million, and that's probably about on the money there in terms of what that looks like. And you know, those agents are going to be careful around who their buyers are and how many buyers they've got on the ground. So there'll always be the onlookers, but their job is to qualify those serious buyers.
You mentioned how, you know, you've been through a few cycles. I'm wondering, in the last few days we've had on the news, you know, in America, in Australian Stock Exchange, really quite dramatic drops. And I always think, from my real estate background, not as advanced as yours, but close, the ebbs and flows of stock real estate, stock real estate. Do you think that's going to positively affect the real estate market when people are saying, whoa, that's being a bit scary, maybe I need to watch, obviously subject to finance?
Yeah, I think history tells us there's a stronger correlation with the cost of money. So when interest rates go down, that's when property prices usually do their best growth story. I don't think that, you know, the dichotomy of shares versus property is an interesting one. Yes, you know, we've got to put our money somewhere. Now, what normally happens is there's a flight to safety. So we'll start to see people focusing on putting their money in their offset accounts, or in potentially, you know, sort of more safe haven investments. The share market's volatility is concerning for a lot of people, and that's why there's usually a flight to bricks and mortar. You know, but that's a little bit volatile at the moment, and the sentiment is really being challenged. So I think for the moment, it's probably going to be hands in pockets, and people not doing anything until they see value. And when they see value, they respond to that both in the share market and also in the property market.